Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the webinar, Better Regulation for Independent Work in Latin America and the Caribbean, the Gig Economy Case. Today's presentation will be in English. You can listen in the original channel or in your preferred language. Just click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen and choose the channel of your preference. This presentation will be organized in the following way. Oliver Azuara will give a 15-minute presentation on the Laboratory of Digital Social Security and its findings, followed by a 30-minute conversation with Jonathan Gruber. Lastly, we will have a 10-minute of Q&A. Our special guest today is Dr. Jonathan Gruber. Dr. Gruber is the fourth professor of economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he has taught since 1992. He is also the former director of the healthcare program at the National Bureau of Economic Research and the former president of the American Society of Health Economists. He is the member of the Institute of Medicine, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Social Insurance, and the Econometric Society. He has published more than 180 research articles, has edited 6 research volumes, and is the author of Public Finance and Public Policy, a leading undergraduate text. During 2009-2010, he served as a technical consultant to the Obama administration and worked with both the administration and Congress to help craft the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. In 2011, he was named one of the top 25 most innovative and practical thinkers of our time by Slate magazine. In both 2006 and 2012, he has rated as one of the top 100 most powerful people in healthcare in the United States by Modern Healthcare magazine. In 2020, he received a Guggenheim Fellowship. Our presentation now will be led by Oliver Azuara, Senior Economist for the IDB Labor Markets Division. Without further ado, please welcome Oliver.
Thank you so much, Catalina. And let me first share my screen. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you to the IDB for the opportunity to present our work at the Laboratory of Digital Social Security, and also thanks to the Labor Markets Division. So it's a great honor having Professor Gruber as a guest today. So let me start with what is the lab, and then we are going to start a conversation with Professor Gruber, who's part of his research or recent research has been focused on how to tailor or design benefits for this type of workers. So, as you know, social security systems in Latin America were designed following the traditional model which links the protection with a formal employment situation. So labor status determines the coverage of a worker and also of the members of the household. However, this has changed over time, and in particular in recent years. During the duration of a job is shorter, and many people hold many jobs at the same time. So this is not new for Latin America. The gig work has been a reality for many centuries, but the key difference is the current use of technology. Technology opens a gateway on how to better cover these workers. So gig work is mainly informal and works with cash. However, the new electronic payments open the window to the traceability of operations, and it could facilitate the collection of taxes and social security contributions. So in Latin America, a big chunk of the labor force is considered independent, aside of the salaried workers that are informal. So it's about a quarter of them are considered independent. So this obviously opens a lot of opportunities to innovate on how to create new products to cover this type of workers. And a big part of these independent workers are considered or declare themselves as being part or using the transport or working in the transport sector. So given this context, the pandemic showed the vulnerability of millions of people in the region. In the worst part of the pandemic, almost 31 million jobs were destroyed. And the shock for the informal and independent workers was bigger, given the lack of coverage against different risks. Obviously, people were looking for different sources of income, and for some of them, the use of ride-hailing and delivery platforms was an alternative to maintain this source of income. So given this context, or anyways, they were not covered by Social Security. And as a response at the IDB, we launched this initiative, the Laboratory of Digital Social Security, to identify cost-effective solutions in order to increase the coverage of independent workers, starting with those using platforms. So, and what does this mean? Well, this initiative has three pillars. The first one is, first, the collection of data, because we don't know many things, because we don't know what are the characteristics of these workers. And so we have been collecting many data in different countries, using surveys and with different sections that I will describe briefly in a second. The second pillar is the design of white papers, or what we call the white papers. And we are currently working on these documents to understand the critical route that an independent worker has to follow in order to comply with the current legislation, and if possible, be covered by the traditional mechanisms. Obviously, this needs to be adapted, and that's why we are currently doing different pilots in order to find the evidence on how effective this new, or these changes can, or what type of changes we can do to the traditional systems. So in the case of the surveys, we have partnered with many companies in the region, including all of these: Uber, Didi Rides, Didi Food, Cabify, Workan, and Rappi. And these surveys have describe what was the labor situation before joining the platforms, the current situation, and what are their expectations and the financial health of all these people. So many of these papers, or the results of these papers are published in the IDB website. And we're currently working on two of them in order to provide a more comprehensive description of this type of work. What are the main takeaways of these surveys? First of all, people who use this type of work value flexibility as the key driver for their decision to join. So because it's easy to generate income with given the low barriers to get into the platforms. So there is a lot of heterogeneity in hours, days, and sociodemographic characteristics. Full-time workers are the minority in many of these cases. So there's like the conception that the great majority of these workers work full-time for a platform or across platforms, which is not the case, because a lot of them use it just to complement their income. Another key finding is that the self-selection, the shadow price of the flexibility so if we ask directly to people or the users, how much will they require? What's the wage they will need in order to abandon using the platform? And in general, we obtain, or the average value that we obtain is that people value the flexibility in 20% of their current income, which means they will get a permanent job if it offers 20% more of what they are making currently using different sources of income. And finally, there is obviously a critique on this type of surveys, because there is a self-selection process in how people are selected inside, or the users of the platforms. So for that reason, we started a new effort to collect data directly in the population using the sample framework of labor surveys. Obviously, this is very expensive, and we just focus on the key markets of the platforms. And we started with Mexico City. And the first finding that we got is that the level or the number of users compared to other markets is very low. So for instance, as Professor Gruber describes in his paper, this is more than 10% in the US, while in Mexico City, which is, I will say, the largest city in Latin America, it's about 3% and 2% for the entire metropolitan area. So this is not obviously this is a large number in terms of the population that is using this type of work. So it's about 300,000 people. But it gives you a good sense of what's the real numbers and how is the composition here and the potential. So the majority of them use mainly one platform, but it's almost half of them that are using multiple platforms. And surprisingly, many of them are covered by the Social Security. And it is because they get this coverage through the other jobs that they have. Finally, the white papers are they're basically, or these documents are tailored for these countries: Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, and Peru, in order to, and they were prepared by experts or external experts on how to increase Social Security coverage of independent workers. They have 3 parts. Obviously, each country is different, the institutions are different, and that's why we wanted to tailor them for the specific reality of each country. The first part has the analysis of the critical route and the friction points that an independent worker has in order to get to be covered by the traditional mechanisms of Social Security. What are the second part is the analysis of barriers in the regulatory and legal frameworks. And finally, we suggest some changes or feasible changes that can be tested in order to improve the current functioning of this system. So it's not like a reform per se, it's just basically how we can improve the current situation. So this is, for instance, the case of Chile that provides the route that an independent worker needs to follow in order to be covered from the moment he or she decides to download the app and then offer the service. And our pilots have been basically focused on voluntary savings. The results are not very, let's say, it's not not very satisfactory, because we will say that there are a lot of barriers that people using platforms face in order to increase their savings for retirement. Obviously, there is a lot of, it's not very simple for them. And that's why I think there is a lot of opportunities for the lab and for researchers to identify ways to create a more sustainable way to facilitate savings for independent workers. Given this context, or it's like what we have done in this over the last year, and that's why we wanted to invite Professor Gruber to discuss, compared to the US and given his knowledge of different elements in the platform economy, what he thinks about this. So comment these findings and talk about more the perspectives for the gig economy. So let me give you, just for to try to give you a bit more comprehensive view of what's going on, a little bit more of context. In your NBER paper, Design Benefits for Platform Workers, you describe 3 challenges for those workers, either independent or salaried, including retirement preparation, health spending risk, and short-term income fluctuations. In many countries, these risks are generally covered by Social Security and the financial system. In Latin America, both systems do not function properly. Some countries show informality levels defined as coverage of Social Security up to 80%. And this is closely related to the functioning of the labor markets, labor institutions, tax collection systems, our cities, geography, and the education systems. So the pandemic, as I mentioned before, showed the vulnerability of a large fraction of the population in the region. It amplified the problems of the low coverage and benefits of social protection systems and the labor markets. Many people need to keep working, mainly in the informal sector, to generate income. And we have documented that the IDB, that many people lost their jobs, use gig platforms as an alternative. These conditions make Latin American countries different compared to other regions with more developed labor markets. The debate on how to regulate the functioning of ride-hailing and delivery platforms was very heated before the pandemic. After almost 3 years of it, the discussions are back. And the IDB would like to help countries to find the best possible regulation to maintain the benefits of this new form of work, keeping in mind the need for the users to be covered against different risks. Given this context, we have prepared many questions for you, Professor, and thank you again for being with us this morning. And the first one is a large fraction, or one of the findings in our survey, is that a large fraction of those who use platform work, particularly ride-hailing, have higher education. For instance, in Colombia, Uber, the Uber riders have 70% of them have higher education. In fact, many of them describe this type of work as temporary while they find a permanent job. How does this affect economic analysis of the platform work regulation from your point of view? Is it desirable to maintain relatively highly educated people in this occupation?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much for having me here. This is such an important topic, and it's very important to recognize to start the very different situation that, say, the US finds itself in relative to Latin America. In the US, we have very low levels of informality, and the gig economy is sort of a new increase in informality that we haven't seen in a long time. In Latin America, there's high levels of informality, and part of what the gig economy is doing in Latin America is just sort of replacing other forms of informality. It's just sort of a new form of informality. In that context, I don't think it's right to ask whether it's desirable or not desirable that higher educated people are in the gig economy. I think the right question is, how should Latin American governments treat the gig economy, given that it's being used by relatively highly educated individuals? In the US, the typical individual gig economy look pretty much like the typical individuals in the workforce. In Latin America, it sounds like they may be even more educated than typical individuals in the workforce. This says to me that there's a valuable flexibility being provided by the gig economy. In the US in particular, it's adding a new degree of flexibility. In Latin America, I think what it's doing is providing if you will, a quasi-formal way for workers who really want to work in the formal sector to have a more formalized, yet flexible way to work. So I think, what my research showed in the US, and what I think this work is showing is that placing significant barriers in the way to gig work could be bad for these workers.
Yeah, so it's a key difference, right? And it's probably because of how the assets of having a car compared to in the US is like a normal good, and almost everybody has it. While in Latin America, probably it's a good that it's more for the higher income, the distribution of the population. So there is a debate on the regulation of digital platforms, and it's basically center of the type of work, independent or salaried, if they depend of the platform or not. So as you describe in your paper, this definition derives from providing benefits through the primary job. However, there are significant differences compared to traditional jobs, right? So most ride-hailers have other occupations, and less than 40% consider it a full-time job. The second is a function of the business. Platforms charge a fee to drivers and users, but the large fraction of the service is received by the driver, who must pay for operational expenses, the depreciation of the asset, and the cost of this asset and capital and their time, right? So in your opinion, what will be an unintended consequence of using the traditional approach to design regulation for this type of work?
Yeah, it's a great question. I should have started with sort of how I got into this, which is I did a project that was funded by Uber. I want to be clear about that. As a project that was funded by Uber to try to understand what the demand was for Uber drivers for different kinds of benefits. So the focus of my research for many decades has been on employer benefits. Uber was interested in how do we think about worker valuation of these benefits. And that's why they asked me to do the study. What my study was not advocacy piece. It was really Uber funded a survey of their drivers, which allowed me to try to collect information on both the characteristics of the drivers and how they value the benefits they might get. And in particular, how they're willing to trade off getting paid in wages versus getting paid in benefits. That was the really exciting part of the study. So to come back to your question, I think the real conclusion I drew from my study is that we have an outdated bimodal in the US, bimodal way of classifying workers. They're either independent contractors, where they're basically on their own for all their benefits, etc., or they're employees subject to a whole host of regulations, which are useful and important, but which limit the flexibility of the work relationship. I would argue, based on what I learned in my study, that basically we need to be thinking about a new third way of categorizing workers, which allows the flexibility of independent contracting, but which recognizes that there's a significant share of this workforce that needs benefits. They need health insurance, they need retirement savings, they need other forms of protection against sickness. And that the weakness of the independent contracting label is it doesn't provide any of that. So the challenge I think my report raises is, how do we create a new category in the US? Once again, we can come to the Latin American context, but in the US, the challenge my report raises is, how do we create a new category that reflects the value that these employees have for flexibility? And importantly, reflects the fact, I think this is true in your context as well from the data you sent, reflects the fact that most of these workers have other jobs. In the US, most of the people who drive for Uber have health insurance. Most people who drive for Uber have another pension savings plan. So we want to recognize that there's a lot of heterogeneity in how much they need new benefits. And that's why what I think the implication for my study, the most important implication for my study, is that we need to think about trying to set up flexible benefit funds for workers, where gig employers have to finance these funds. We have to require that employee benefits get financed. That much like traditional employers put money aside for benefits. And so, for example, I'm familiar with the context of Mexico, where the formal sector has to contribute to EAMS, and EAMS provides benefits to formal sector workers. In the US, the formal sector has to put aside money for health insurance and Social Security and things like that. We should have requirements like that on gig employers. But those requirements shouldn't necessarily be for a particular type of benefit, rather reflecting the flexible needs of the gig workforce. The requirement should be for just a more general funding of a benefits fund that employees can draw on.
And do you think that, so both the platform and the worker need to contribute?
I think that's right. I think the important aspect is that the platform needs to establish it and contribute, and it needs to facilitate the worker contributing. What we know, so what's quite interesting from my study was the piece. So what I did is it was a neat survey. We surveyed Uber drivers, and we asked them essentially how much wages they'd be willing to give up. How many dollars in wages would they be willing to give up to get $1 in, say, health insurance, or $1 in retirement income? Obviously, most people would not give up $1 to get $1 because they'd rather have the wages. What we found is people really are willing to give up quite a lot, close to $1, to get retirement savings. They're willing to give up less to get health insurance, I think reflecting the fact that most have health insurance on their other jobs. But in particular, there was a large demand for retirement savings. And I think what we know from a large research in behavioral economics in the US is that retirement savings is encouraged both by employer contributions, but also by making it easier for workers to set aside their earnings for retirement. That workers, if you just give them the paychecks, they tend to save less than if you sort of give them mechanisms to set it aside and help make it, the easier you make it to sort of divert your income towards retirement savings, the more retirement savings that gets done.
What we have found is that the critical part there is where to, catch their attention, right? So it's like there are critical points where you need to do this type of interventions. Otherwise, it's not going to work, right? So it's like when they subscribe to the platform, and otherwise, if they have so many things going on in their minds and they are working, just thinking about many things, that it is impossible to get their attention to talk about pensions or health, because they don't care in their current days.
That is absolutely right. And what we've demonstrated in economic research is the power of defaults.
Right.
What we mean by that is it's hard to get people's attention. So for example, when workers sign up, you can ask them, do you want to put aside 3% of your wages in pensions?
Mhm.
Or you can say, we're going to put aside 3% of your wages in pensions unless you don't want us to. Now, those questions are the same, and yet they have dramatically different effects, which is people are like, oh, I guess if you're going to put it away, I guess I'll take that. Whereas if I have to make a conscious effort to put it away, I won't. So these are called nudges. And these sorts of nudges can make a big difference. The most exciting thing we explored, I think, in this study is a very famous idea from the Nobel Prize winning economist Richard Thaler. He calls it the Save More Tomorrow plan. And here's how Thaler's plan works. He said this was for traditional employees. He went to traditional employees and said, would you be willing to sign up for a plan where every time you get a raise in the future, 50% of that raise gets put in a savings account? So you don't have to consume any less today. It's just saying when you get a raise in the future, you agree to save out of that raise. Workers loved that plan and contributed massively to it. I asked a similar question in my survey of Uber drivers. What about a saving system where in a week where you make a lot of money, we take the extra and put it in a retirement plan? They love that idea. So I think setting up those kinds of defaults or nudges is critical to actually getting workers to properly fund their retirement, or in other contexts where health insurance is less common, to fund their health spending as well.
Mhm. A key difference in Latin America is that many countries have developed like non-contributory health systems that provides a basic benefit to everyone.
Mhm.
Obviously, the quality varies across countries and also inside the country, and also non-contributory pensions. So obviously it's like a basic benefit when you retire. So it will be good just to, I mean, there is like a floor for everyone, and then they just put another step in this floor for this type of workers, independent workers, to, these defaults can serve for that purpose.
I think, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No.
I think this is a critical issue, which is, let's talk about differences in Latin America. Probably the most important difference is you have an explicit two-tier healthcare system where you have a basic healthcare system that's available to everyone. It's often low quality, and then individuals can supplement that. And that supplementation can be very important. For example, I just finished a really exciting study in Mexico where we did a randomized trial evaluating a supplementary diabetes program provided to individuals who are already getting universal health care coverage through EAMS and other systems. What we found was that supplementary diabetes program had a huge effect in improving health. I think that we have a system where there's scope to improve the healthcare you get through additional contributions to the public system. And that could be, once again, an important source of benefits for these kinds of gig workers.
Great. Just I've been asked just to repeat this. Hay interpretación simultánea. Cualquier persona la puede accesar utilizando en la barra inferior el icono que dice interpretación. So it's just a reminder of our translation.
Sure.
So here's another question. So, or from this conversation, we find that there is no one size fits all for regulations in such a complex issue in every country, right? So judging by this international experiences and your own research, can you identify the few elements that are the most relevant in the regulations to work the best? Or any pitfalls that we must avoid? Is self-definition of independent worker like a good way to do it?
I think that, first of all, this is a very hard question. I think it varies country by country.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's very important to remember the country-specific context in which you're doing this. I think I don't have a specific answer. I have a general answer. And the general answer is what I said before, which is, how do you, in the US, as we say, thread the needle between making sure that we maintain the flexibility that is so valued by workers, but moving towards more social protections, which are so critical all over the world. And I think that, once again, Mexico's the country I know best. If you think about a system where under EAMS, there's quite a high charge on employers that finances a large range of benefits, from childcare to pensions to health, to savings, to disability benefits. I don't think we should ask gig employers to contribute as much as we're asking formal sector employers to contribute. but I think we shouldn't ask nothing of them either. We should start to move in that direction. But importantly, we need to think about how we give those benefits to workers. In the US, and I think the critical thing is to ask, among the gig workers in these countries, this is where your surveys can help. How many of them are also formal sector workers versus how many of them are purely informal sector workers? If a lot of them are formal sector workers trying to make extra money on the side, then I think it's critical to leave maximum flexibility in what is done with any social protection funds that are set aside. So that's the case in the US. In the US, I would argue strongly based on my research, since most gig workers are also formal sector workers, that we should not say the money has to go to health insurance or has to go to pensions or has to go to something else. We should instead say, here's a fund that must be set aside a certain amount of your wages, but we can be flexible in how it's used. Now, on the other hand, if it turns out most of what gig work is doing in Latin America is simply, it's mostly informal workers just taking another form of informal work, then we may want to be more prescriptive in what happens with the money to make sure since those informal workers have no source of protection to start with, there's no base there. We may want to be more prescriptive in how the money's spent. So I think the level of prescriptiveness depends on where most of the workers are coming from. And so I think what you want to think, so once again, my main point is it's time for a new categorization. It's time to think about a new categorization. That's my main point. And how that categorization works is there should clearly be a significant set aside of worker pay towards social protection funds. The question of how you structure them is going to depend on really where the workers are coming from who are serving the gig economy.
Yeah, definitely. And many research also in Latin America shows that people go on and off from the formal sector. So it's a very dynamic. So the threshold is very high, as you were mentioning. This package in many countries, in particular in Mexico, as you were mentioning, it's about 40%. So people go in and out from the formal sector depending on the job. And obviously, this is the gig work, it's pretty much facilitating this process because people do the driving thing for a few hours a week. But if they find a full-time job, they probably lower the number of hours they do or completely exit this option. So the data of our surveys show that the main drivers for using a platform are income generation and flexibility. In the last case, the shadow price of flexibility measured, as I was mentioning before, as the wage differential to accept a permanent job with no flexibility is between 25 and 40%. So it's basically depends on the country, depends on the conditions, but depends on how the survey is collected, right? So if you go directly to one company, they will say something, but if you go to a different company or the entire population, the margin is different. So in addition to the level of churn, the level of churn in this company is very high, as we know. People go in and out. So in your opinion, what will be the effect of categorizing work as employees or instead of independent workers? So basically, from our previous conversation, you are gonna restrict the options for many workers. That could be like an expected outcome of a regulation that forces platforms to consider them and their employers?
Yeah, I think especially in Latin America, it would be dangerous to force formalization on this sector. I think that there's in the US, there's not nearly as much flexibility to be formal versus informal. I think it'd be much more dangerous in a Latin American context to force formalization on the sector, because it's so easy for workers to then say, fine, I'm not going to work in the sector if it's formal. There's so much, if you will, substitution between formal and informal. So I really do think the idea of just throwing this sector into the formal category is a mistake. I think that what really needs to happen, once again, is to have it be sort of between the existing informal and formal sectors, in that, unlike the informal sector, there's a significant investment in social protection out of the pay these workers get. But unlike the formal sector, there's flexibility with things like hours and minimum wages and benefit design.
Well, yeah, no, I think that's a very clear response, because it's like there is also a risk of moral hazard, right? So adverse selection here, because people will see this type of work as an easy gateway to full coverage for many risks that they are probably facing. Right. So it's an unintended consequence that we can probably find, but we'll see. So many countries in Latin America have pension systems based on individual accounts. As you know, it's like this was reforms that took place during the 80s and 90s, and now many countries still have these individual accounts. So contributions to retirement insurance are accumulated and managed by professional pension funds. We have tried many voluntary mechanisms for independent workers to use these accounts over the last 4 years, but the take-up rates are very low. And the final number of savers is even lower. Obviously, we are adapting and suggesting these independent workers to use their individual account. Obviously, this is very difficult, as for many barriers that there is even a publication on this at the IDB that's available in the IDB website. So what's your suggestion? Should regulators push for automatic debits from the platforms, or any specific programs for them, keeping them at the status of independence? So what's your idea there?
What I feel strongly about is that I think there should be an automatic, that there should be a set aside of some fraction of pay to pay for social protection. What I feel less strongly about is how that should be regulated or dedicated. So for example, what I would say would be that there should be something which says, for example, 10% of the worker's pay should be set aside. Now, whether you label that as paid by Uber or paid by the worker doesn't really matter, but you set that aside. I would then basically, I would also try to set some more defaults to get workers to have money in pension in individual savings accounts. Now, I don't think that there should necessarily be a regulation, X% of this goes to individual savings accounts and Y% goes to health insurance. I think I want to leave more flexibility than that. But I do think we could set up, for example, you could say 10% of wages go into this account. The default is going to be half is going to go into an individual retirement account and half is going to go into an account you can use for health. And if you want to change the default, you can change it, but this is the default. Most people would follow the default, and you would get a significant contribution to retirement savings in that world.
Is there any like a current pilot or a project that you know about this type of mechanisms that we can?
No, I was going to ask you to run it. I think you should run that pilot.
Absolutely. We're going to try our best there. So a key part in your paper is that, a key finding that I found very interesting is that people do not value, or the highest value is for retirement, right? So it's not health. And can you please elaborate a little bit more on why you think this order came across, and why people, it's health is a tangible thing, and obviously with the pandemic, it was very clear that if you are not insured, you can be at risk of being poor. And so can you please elaborate what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm primarily a health economist, so I was a little disappointed by this finding, to be honest. I think it reflects two things. One is, I think it reflects that the rate of health insurance coverage in this population is much higher than the rate of pension coverage. So once again, these are largely formal sector workers using this as a supplement to their formal sector work. And most of these workers, through themselves or their spouses or the government, had health insurance coverage. Especially through the Affordable Care Act, we've now set up a pretty broad safety net for health insurance coverage. We have a less comprehensive safety net for retirement coverage. I mean, we have Social Security, but in terms of individual retirement, we have a less broad safety net. So I think the main reason people are valuing retirement more is more of them need it. The second reason is I think a lot of Uber drivers are young, healthy people who think they're invincible and don't think they need the health protection. I think that's a little bit of a mistake. I think people don't quite understand the health risks they face. But even post-COVID, I think people feel pretty invincible, and they'd rather have money for retirement than for protection against health.
Yeah, actually, one of the key findings in our survey is that we ask people what they think about the future and how they're gonna, when they get older, how they're gonna survive. And one of the main responses that they are gonna keep working.
Yeah.
So everybody, we assume that your, physical strength is gonna be the same even if you're 80, which is not the case. And it's like, that's why it's so important just to create these mechanisms of insurance. And a key element also, we are in the surveys that we have collected is that we ask about people about their trusts in the social security systems and also in the financial systems. It's because this is very related. So it's like how people if they don't trust in the institutions, they're not going to put their money. And surprisingly, it's less than 50% in some cases. So obviously this represents a major barrier for contributing, because you don't see, if you don't trust, the money you're not going to be contributing happily to it. So is there any suggestion on how to tailor these new types of, funds flexible funds that you are suggesting, or how can they be managed in order to gain the trust from the gig workers? And finally, well, and there's another question after.
That's a great point. I mean, once again, obviously a major issue in the context of less developed countries is the reliability of financial options, the reliability of places to put your money. And that's a concern. And I don't have a great answer in that. That's a larger concern about the financial sector and the way it's structured in these countries. I do think continuously reminding workers of the contributions of what they have, of how it's growing, is valuable to get them invested in this. So I think really free flow of information, so they just put the money away and never see it again, that they're getting constant reminders and information. But I think it's critical that they're putting this money in places they feel are going to be valid and going to be there when they retire.
Great. Also, a question that I was forgetting is about, there's a key difference between couriers and ride-hailers, right? So in general, ride-hailers are older. In Latin America, at least, it's mainly men. So it's more than 90% in each country is only men. So it's an occupation mainly for men. And while the couriers that the food industry are relying on them a lot is basically young people with low income, and in many cases is also the gateway for many migrants to start generating income. So do you think this flexible mechanism should be the same for both type of so it's like a general view for this type of workers, or what's your takeaway there?
I think that's the reason it should be flexible. Is that this is an incredibly diverse workforce, both in terms of their age, their gender, their health needs, and once again, what they're doing with the rest of their time, if it's formal, informal, etc. So I think I don't think it says it should be different. I think it just says it should be flexible. Because the problem making it different is most people in the US at least do both. So in the US, I don't know if it's true in Latin America, in the US, most people who are doing Uber are also doing Uber Eats or doing, DoorDash or whatever. So I think that if you try to separate it, it's going to be tricky. One thing I argue in this paper is the reason for government involvement is that you really would like, and this is something we haven't covered yet, but I think is important, you'd like there to be a fund which is for all the gig jobs workers have. You'd like to say, look, this is a government sanctioned fund that all your gig employers contribute to, and then there's one pot of money. You don't want to necessarily have an Uber fund and a Lyft fund, etc. You want them to contribute together. And the only way to do that is really to have a government organized contribution mechanism. And in that sense, I wouldn't distinguish it across different types of gig work. I'd have one organized mechanism.
Great. So actually, as you were mentioning, well, gig work is here to stay, right? So it's unlike the on-site workers like drivers and couriers, other gig workers will remain independent. Say freelance graphic designer, picking up fewer jobs. Could these platforms leverage their technology to help provide certain social security benefits for their users? you think are freelancers interested in these in platforms that does? So it's like, do you think we should treat the other platforms the same way as this other one?
Yeah, I don't quite understand. Are you saying should we let freelancers use the Uber?
Yeah, no, all these mechanisms that we have been talking about.
Yeah, I think in general, the problem of informality in the Latin American context
Mhm.
is that workers are not ending up with the social protections they need.
Mhm.
That basically, if you think about a worker, we think workers tend to undervalue the need for both retirement savings and health insurance.
Mhm.
So imagine you're a worker in Mexico and you could earn less money and work in the formal sector or more money and work in the informal sector. You might not appreciate the formal sector comes with a whole host of social protections. And you
Mhm.
might work in the informal sector, ignoring the fact that you're going to end up in worse shape at the end because you don't have health care, you don't have retirement, you don't have sickness benefits. I think the way to resolve that is to try to move more towards a middle ground where informal sector workers retain the benefits of informality, but are moving towards more social protections more generally. I don't think it's just about gig work. I think it's more generally a path that informal work needs to take in Latin America.
Okay. Yeah, no, so the main takeaway from this conversation is that there is a need for the new definition of this type of work. And eventually, switching from one type to another type has to be easier in order to maintain the benefits over time. If you can collect or, save the contributions over your life, your professional life, in order to have a better retirement is a key part. So it's like facilitating the process is a key element here. But sometimes platforms do not want to get involved with workers. So in general, they put like these websites where you provide information. That's because they don't want to be, in the legislation, if they provide or give evidence of having a different type of relationship, it's complicated for them. So they provide this information and that's it. So the key part will be how to approach workers to to define the benefits or to the contributions here. So any suggestions there? So it's
Yeah, it's a good point, but I think this is where you need to go ahead and make these companies a little uncomfortable. This is, I'd imagine, you could imagine taking what I'm saying as, I'd imagine many people in the US would say, well, that I'm being too nice to gig employers, that they should be required to formalize. I think there should be real burdens put on the gig employers to provide these benefits. And I think that if that's costly to them, et cetera, well, tough luck. This is something that their workers need, and these employers should be required to provide these kinds of benefits to their workers.
Perfect. So we're gonna open the floor for questions from the public, and if any of you want, just please write your questions in the Q&A icon. And so finally, let me go back to how some platforms work in Latin America. So for instance, many do delivery with different people. So it's one person who is registered with the platform, but many of them are in the same car, for instance. So they deliver. So that's like a mini firm with some employees. So in that case, that could difficult this process. So should we just focus on the person per se, or what do you see? Because it's still like a risk, or the job risk is faced, but not only by the driver, but also the person who is joining him.
That's a great point. I hadn't thought about that. I think the answer, I think you can only do this for those who are actually registered. I think trying to figure out who's not registered doing the services is a nightmare. And that in some sense is exactly why you can't put too many restrictions on gig work, because then what you'll do is people avoid it by just having one worker and then a bunch of people working under him who are avoiding the regulations. So I think that, we should try to get as many of those people registered as possible, but it sort of highlights the economic forces working against formalizing this sector, which is the more formal you make it, the more burdensome you make it, the more people will avoid it by having these mini firms. And that's the problem.
Yeah. definitely. Any of your research has also focused on, the migration part? So how the people can like contribute to their families in their origin country?
No, I haven't worked on that. It's an interesting question, but
Yeah.
I've not worked on that.
Okay. And well, so I don't know if there's any other question from the public. I think it's really important just to, summarizing what you said is we take the invitation to start working on the pilot to test this new flexible mechanism. And that's actually one of the key objectives for 2023, and try to see what can be done in order to bring this flexibility, but at the same time create like a minimum floor for all the workers. And in the case of there is another question on the defaults. Let me just translate. Having defaults for savings for retirement is ideal, but in our pilots has been a problem using these mechanisms. In the there is like the legal aspect of it, so you need to ask for it, and this difficults the testing the mechanism. What's your takeaway there?
Yeah, I mean, the legal problem with defaults is employers are worried that if you default someone into a plan, let's say you default someone into a retirement plan and the institution goes bankrupt, that they can then sue you, the employer, for having defaulted them into that plan. And I think this only works so employers get indemnified if they get protected against those lawsuits. I think you can't. The problem with defaults is employers are worried they can be sued for what the default is. I think as long as there's a regulated set of defaults, if employers fall within that regulated set, they shouldn't be able to be sued for what happened.
Yeah, definitely. Wait, is there anything that I haven't asked you and you would like to emphasize at this point?
No, that's it. I think this is great. And I really think I'm glad you're working on this topic. I think it's a really important topic.
Thank you so much for your time, and we'll be in touch. I don't know let me just ask again if you have any other questions from the public. If not, then we're golden.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor.
You bet. Bye-bye.
Take care. Thank you, everybody, for being here.